All right, so let's get things started. Um, if you've never attended one of these calls today, welcome. This is our we believe our largest ever. We've still got quite a few people trickling in. We usually host these every couple of weeks, um, and we'll get a smattering of people that varies quite a bit. But we had over 250 people sign up for today. So I really think that is a testament to the importance and interest in the topic that we're going to be discussing today. And then as always, whenever we discuss these things, whenever we discuss how we as a society and a community can best steward the resources of our land, how we can best protect the environment we all inhabit, how we can build a more just and equitable society, we of course cannot ignore the founding and ongoing injustice visited against all the nations and peoples that called this land home for time immemorial. And to be frank, nor can we merely offer trite words such as these without actually doing the work that is required of our political community. On Saturday, we'll have yet more cause to examine all the ways in which we're dragging our feet on that work. So whether you find yourself on treaty land today, or as in my case, on the unceded land of the Anishinaabe, let's proceed humbly and with gratitude for the people and perspectives that hopefully will enrich our conversation today and do so in our communities every day. So today, this is a community call. So we try our best to keep these from slowly moving over into the Zoom lectures. We really try and make this an engaging call where we're going to be answering your questions, where we hope for your participation. The format is I'll give a brief introduction of the organizations. I'll have a short conversation with our guest today, give you an overview of his expertise, his experience, but the majority of the time is going to be devoted to your questions. So I'll talk you through very shortly how you can submit and vote on those questions. You might notice here that the call is being hosted today by both UBI Works and Commonwealth. Sometimes these calls are hosted by one or the other organization, but today it's both because of the relevance that our topic today has for both of these organizations' respective missions. So if you're familiar with UBI Works, it concerns itself with the pressing and near-term goal of establishing a basic income. And as we are reminded by such calls as we're in the final report for the murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls, this work is literally a matter of life and death for members of our community. And we do this work. Our theory of change at UBI Works is to make it a winning political issue. And core to that is reframing the idea of basic income, not just as a handout, but what should be available to all members of an incredibly prosperous society when they are experiencing moments, for whatever reason, that they are shut out of that prosperity. And that's why, since the very origins of this idea, that in order to make it politically palatable, that there have been so many calls for it to be funded, not from taxes on the middle class, but through charges on our collective prosperity, on things like resources and pollutants like carbon. Meanwhile, Commonwealth concerns itself with a somewhat larger perspective. It identifies all the wealth that is generated by our shared inheritance. Those are our things, the wealth produced by our natural world and what we do collectively. And it says, not only could this wealth be much better spent on things like a basic income, or like dividends, or like reducing income taxes, but the very fact that this commonwealth is accruing into private hands, the very fact that that the wealth that land generates is ending up in the balance sheet of corporate landlords, is what is distorting our markets. It is what is causing a shortage of housing. It is what is causing an affordability crisis. Because there's just too much money to be made, frankly, in capturing some of that shared wealth for yourself. We call that rent seeking. And the report that you see on screen is our attempt to put a number on just how much of a problem that rent seeking is in our economy. And so when this happens, the classic benefits of supply and demand of the free market, they just don't work. They don't meet the needs of consumers and citizens. So instead, we get ever larger monopolies, we get an ever more expensive cost of living. And how we fix that, of course, is by capturing this shared wealth and ensuring that it is indeed shared. And we can do that with policies like charging when someone pollutes the air we all breathe and ensuring everyone gets a slice. Again, quite relevant to our discussion today. So as always on these calls, we take community questions through a service we use called Slido. The link will be shortly popping up in the chat, or you can follow the instructions on screen. Feel free at any time to submit your questions and vote on the questions that other people submitted. We do our best with only the slightest of consolidation to answer the questions in the order that they are voted upon. But so without further ado, we'll get started into the meat and potatoes of today. I'd like to introduce Brendan Frank, who is the Director of Policy and Strategy at Clean Prosperity. As you will very shortly hear, he is a font of knowledge regarding carbon pricing. For those of you who remember, he worked for the Ecofiscal Commission. That was the organization primarily responsible for the reports and the background work that really made it feasible for a government to introduce carbon pricing. And he has since worked in preserving and improving carbon pricing regimes across the country. So Brendan, thank you very, very much for being here and joining us today.
Great to be with you, Liam. Thanks everyone for coming.
So perhaps maybe the best place to start, Brendan, would be to just give people an overview of how carbon pricing works in this country. I'm sure that people, particularly those of us in the backstop provinces like Ontario, we're familiar with the surcharge on gas. We've seen the stickers at the pumps. Maybe every so often we see the climate action incentive payments show up in our bank accounts. But I feel most people probably don't really understand the regime as a whole. So could you give us a little bit of an overview, explain how it works across the different jurisdictions, how it works both on the retail, on the consumer side, and in industry?
Yeah, so it's a fairly straightforward question with a fairly long and complicated answer. I'll try to be brief. So as you alluded to, Liam, there are actually two different types of carbon pricing in Canada. There's the retail carbon price and there's the industrial carbon price. And each province has one of each. And the basic arrangement is that if the provinces design their own systems, which they are encouraged and welcome to do, they can choose what they do with the revenues for both systems. And if they are not interested in implementing their own system, then the federal government steps in and implements what is called the backstop. And basically all the provinces have to do to maintain control of their own systems is commit to the price path that has been laid out, which is $170 a ton by 2030. The climate action incentive payments that you allude to, that is the government returning all of the revenues it collects from one province from a particular province to that same province. So all the money collected from Ontario gets returned to Ontario. All the money collected from Alberta returns to Alberta, which is why the checks in Alberta are bigger than Ontario, because Alberta has more emissions per capita.
Fascinating. Okay, so I think that's a great place to start. Concerning most of the people in the room today, the reason I say most people are here is that we're all advocates for one major policy shift. So we've often talked about on these calls how policies like a national basic income or ambitious policies like a national value tax face a lot of the hurdles that carbon pricing faced, and a lot of the hurdles that carbon pricing is still trying to surmount. So there are likely lots of different political challenges, constitutional questions, design considerations, all these things that are facing these two movements that have already been undertaken by the carbon pricing, the environmental movement. So it seems like there's a lot of lessons on the table for us to learn. Lessons about how to build political coalitions, how to introduce this to the voting public, how to evangelize the benefits of these policies. So could you take us through a little bit of the history of advocacy for carbon pricing? Where did it start? How did it get its legs? When did politicians start taking it seriously? How did we end up with this law that we have today?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different places we could start with that. So the interest in pricing carbon or pollution or any other form of environmental bad has been in economic theory for the better part of a century now. And what it really needed to get legs in Canada was one, proof of concept, two, unexpected advocates, and lastly, and perhaps most importantly, a policy window. So you may recall in the 80s that there was a huge problem with acid rain, and the way that the United States took care of that problem was to establish a cap and trade market for sulfur pollution. And now we don't have acid rain anymore. So that was proof of concept.
I recall that personally, but I I do remember.
Yes, nor I, but
Yeah,
I've heard stories.
Yeah.
And it worked incredibly effectively. So it showed that environmental markets can work. And then in terms of carbon pricing, so it wasn't really an issue that was high on a lot of politicians' radar through the 80s and 90s and even parts of the 2000s. I would say the grassroots role in eventually making carbon pricing a reality in Canada was really to call attention to the challenge of climate change. You need to sell the problem before you can sell the solution. And it wasn't obvious to a lot of politicians that A, it was a problem, and that B, it should be prioritized. And we got proof of concept on a carbon price, a retail carbon price in Canada in 2008. BC was the first jurisdiction to do that. It was a $30 a ton carbon price that was offset entirely by income tax cuts. And then the same year, the 2008 federal election, Stéphane Dion, I would say very courageously made that the centerpiece of his policy platform. The Liberals quite famously lost that election. But the idea didn't go away because the soundness of the economics behind the idea remained. And then several organizations throughout the 2010s, including the Ecofiscal Commission, turned their attention again to the cause of pollution pricing as the challenge of climate change became more evident. And then we were off to the races once a policy window opened in about 2015, 2016.
And then can you take us through what happened in regards to when did the coalitions really start coming together? When did it cross that barrier between the many policies that get discussed in campaigns into something that actually became a legislation?
Yeah, so in 2015, the federal Liberals in their election platform committed to addressing climate change in a serious way, but they were vague about what that actually entailed. Their first, yes, I can be more specific about the policy window. So you may recall Prime Minister Trudeau's first international trip was to Paris to negotiate the Paris Agreement. And that created a lot of momentum within Canada. And a little less than a year later, we got the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, of which carbon pricing was a tenet. And when I say the policy window opened, I mean we had alignment across both the federal government and the provinces, all committed to solving this issue. Alberta was really the linchpin. There was a provincial NDP government that was more interested in moving forward on the challenge of climate change than successor governments were. So we had a clear and pressing need, an international momentum, and most importantly for Canada, alignment across the Federation that this was something that needed to happen. And every single province, save for Saskatchewan and Manitoba, who eventually signed on, every province signed the Pan-Canadian Framework with a commitment to using pollution pricing as the centerpiece of a broader plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to climate change.
And can you circle back to, I think, point 2 there, you said unexpected advocates?
Yeah, so the push within civil society, the organization I worked for, the Ecofiscal Commission, led on some of this. We certainly weren't the only voice in the conversation, but we were backed by a very, very diverse advisory board. And when I say diverse, I mean ideologically diverse advisory board, who all said, you know what, pollution pricing is a good idea. These were established figures with some credibility to their names, and it ran the ideological spectrum. We had Preston Manning and Jack Mintz, on one side. We had Bob Ray, Paul Martin, and the head of the David Suzuki Foundation on the other side. And that is a really powerful statement, right? When you have that that broad of an ideological spectrum all saying this is a good idea, it tends to get the attention of policymakers.
And was that a coalition that was built, or that manifested on the merits of the policy itself?
Yeah, I think it was just an idea whose time had come, and there was real strong leadership within the commission to assemble these voices, to get them to back the idea in a public way, and then to produce, robust and rigorous research to back up those points of view.
So you mentioned you were at the Ecofiscal Commission at the time. How did you get involved? How did you get into that? What have you been doing since? And what does the work at Clean Prosperity look like at the moment?
Yeah, so Ecofiscal started in 2014 and laid out a roadmap for designing carbon pricing in Canada, basically provincially led and federally backstopped, which was eventually the model that the federal government went with. I joined in 2016, a week before Donald Trump became president, and that kind of changed the dynamic. All of a sudden, it was, why would we do this if the U.S. isn't moving on it? So played a lot of defense on carbon pricing once the policy was actually implemented. Spent several years at Ecofiscal, and I now find myself at an organization called Clean Prosperity, who is continuing a lot of the same work, focused on market-based environmental policies. And our focus right now, I joined the organization in January and have been seized with two primary issues. One is making sure that industrial carbon markets work a little more effectively, and we're currently pushing very hard on a program called Carbon Contracts for Difference. And the second issue is the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, which is a very good thing for the U.S. and for the world, but also creates a lot of competitive challenges for Canada.
Would you care to plug Carbon Contracts for a Difference?
Sure. So basically, the idea is that it's like an insurance policy for carbon markets. Right now, there are a lot of big emitters, so like oil refineries, chemical facilities, steel, aluminum, cement, pulp and paper, and they're not confident enough that the carbon price is going to rise in these markets as planned to make these investments, because the credits they can generate with those investments in these markets are an important source of revenue. So Carbon Contracts for Difference basically is an insurance policy that will provide a minimum value for these credits that emitters will generate in the market, give them the confidence they need to make investments today. And it's kind of right under the gun for our 2030 targets. Projects that receive final investment decisions in 2023 will probably come online something between 2027 and 2029.
So I think that's, could you give us, I think most people still don't understand how carbon pricing works, not in the commercial side. What is it, when you talk about whether or not these large emitters are willing to make the investments, are they paying the same carbon tax that we're all paying at the moment?
So no is the short answer. So you don't actually want these large emitters who produce, thousands of times the emissions that the typical household produces to pay for every single ton of carbon they produce. In many instances, it would actually be cheaper for those facilities to shut down than to pay the entire carbon price. So what you do instead is you make them pay on a portion of their emissions. So there's a high carbon price at the margin, but a lower average cost. And that helps protect the competitiveness while ensuring they still have a strong incentive to reduce their emissions. And as I mentioned earlier on the call, there are a range of very different systems across Canada on the industrial side. Alberta uses a facility performance standard. Quebec has a cap and trade system. The federal government uses output-based pricing. I'll stop with the jargon now, but all that to say, the provinces aren't harmonized, say, the way that you would hope an industrial market would be.
Okay, so let's pivot from the jargon then. Let's get back to the pocketbook issues most people care about. So it seems like the core, most of us here today are concerned about are interested in how carbon pricing works and translates into payments in all of our bank accounts, the climate action incentive payments. And that certainly seems a very, certainly for those in the lowest decile, it is a non-negligible impact on their spending power. Does certainly give some Canadians more money every month, or excuse me, not every month, but every quarter. So it seems also a core feature when we think about the political viability and how it ever got passed and how it's going to maintain enough political will to keep going. Do you have any insight into how this came to be? So it strikes me that if you're gonna charge for carbon, there's lots you could do with it. You could invest in solar farms. You could cut taxes, like you said they did in BC. During the development of the policy, was there how did we land on the mix that we have now? Was there a debate about how progressive to make it, or about how much it should instead compensate every Canadian? Do you have any insight into the design of the rebate?
Yeah, so the rebate is fundamentally a compromise. It's the most economically efficient thing to do with the revenues would be to cut income taxes. However, because only some provinces are participating in the federal system, you can't cut federal taxes with those revenues in an equitable way. So the idea behind a rebate was essentially that it's the cleanest, simplest way to return all of the revenues that were collected in a particular province to that same province. There was a very healthy debate in 2015, 2016, 2017 about what to do with the revenues, and there were various organizations and voices in the ecosystem who had strong points of view on that. And I would say, if you're debating what to do with the revenues, that's a good spot to be, right? That's a good conversation to be having. It means we agree on the initial premise. So I'll actually just plug a blog that I wrote in 2019 that shows what different provinces are doing with the revenues. It sort of lays out the menu of options. Quebec does do a little bit more of that green spending. BC is mostly tax cuts, but also subsidizing health premiums and the like. But administratively, it's a much easier thing to do to just return all of the revenues. So that's ultimately what the federal government chose to do.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much for sharing. I'm sure we'll share with people after the call as well in case you miss these links as they're going by. So for those who are coming to the call from a Commonwealth perspective, and who are primarily concerned about policies that can better account for the negative externalities caused by pollution or capturing the rents that are generated by the fossil fuel industry. Do you have any thoughts about how this model that we ended up with, or any of the models in any of the provinces that we currently have, this kind of tax and rebate model, could it be applied to other pollutants? Could it be applied beyond carbon?
It could be, certainly. The caution I would throw out there for consideration is that the goal of carbon pricing, or any form of pollution pricing for that matter, is to eventually eliminate itself. So that requires some careful planning, right? You don't want to end up in a position where people become dependent on the dividends as a source of income when that source of income is eventually going to go away, or should go away in theory.
Right. So it's not the best thing to base a basic income on if we hope we'll decarbonize the whole economy very soon.
Exactly. Yeah. So ideally, right, the carbon pricing will eliminate the need for itself by 2050, hopefully sooner. And the whole point of a carbon price or any pollution price is to avoid paying it. Right? Yeah. So there's a tension there.
I also want to circle back to, and I think I'll end this here and then shortly turn it over to questions. So if you haven't had a chance yet, Ken will post the Slido link again. Please submit your questions and vote on the ones that you would like to see answered. But you mentioned before this idea of the policy window. We got some more questions in the chat about it. I want to return to this. So you talked about there was a couple of factors that came to be to make a moment in time, and where it was suddenly politically viable. And often I think when those of us who are convinced of our own the righteousness of the policies that we are advocating for, we like to think about them like there's an element of inevitability. Like we are going to get this done, and we are in a constant march towards that outcome.
The arc of the universe.
Indeed,
Yes.
indeed. But you talked about that it was a unique moment in time that allowed this major policy to happen. And so my question is, I think that is perhaps most relevant to all the advocates in the room, is what was required to be ready to take advantage of that moment, to meet that moment? What did we need to have ready? What did civil society, what work must have they already had done such that when these factors came about, society and the voting public and politicians were all ready to jump?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing is credible and rigorous research that offers a roadmap to policymakers. It's helpful to have allies, but if you have to start from scratch, it's good to have something that is robust to point to so that you can hold the hands of prospective allies and meet them halfway and carry them the rest. I should add, though, that Ecofiscal did get lucky in a sense, right? Things very easily could have transpired another way in the 2015 election or in Paris. So it really was, we seized an opportunity when it presented itself, but that opportunity wasn't inevitable. So you need to pick your moments and know when to go. And when you are ready to go, you should have ideally credible research and credible voices behind that research.
Well, thank you very much for the briefest of overviews of a very complicated policy and the long history of bringing it about in Canada. I think we'll turn it over now to questions generated in the chat. So thank you everyone who did that. At the top, some of these questions, I think, Brendan, will be directly applicable to you. Others, we might broaden the voices that we have. We are, as always, joined by some very prominent activists in both camps today. The first question, if you have any thoughts about, is in a political landscape dominated by the left-right issues and by this political divide, how could UBI or Commonwealth allow for cooperation across the political spectrum? If you have any thoughts, I'll let you comment. But if not, perhaps I'll turn it over to the founder of both those organizations, Floyd Marinescu, who's also on the call.
I'll cede the floor for now.
Oh, sounds good. Floyd, do you care to take this one?
Sure, throw me under the bus. Yeah, well, I was really struck, Brendan, with your point that you had diverse voices across the left and right advocating for carbon pricing. Like you mentioned Preston Manning, and I think that is also possible for some of these ideas. It's certainly possible for guaranteed basic income. We have, we've had now late conservative senators Hugh Segal, who's been a prolific champion, and we're going to do our best to continue promoting his message. And really across all the different parties are for a guaranteed basic income. So, that does exist. Obviously, more inroads need to be made with the Conservatives. And then on some of the policies advocated by Commonwealth Canada, there is always historically been a diverse range of voices in favor of land value tax, as well as in favor of sovereign wealth funds. I think they're just not really seen, or it's just not in the media yet. These coalitions don't yet exist. So that's what we're going to try and do, is create them and make sure that the existing support is visible. And yeah, Brendan can certainly use your advice on that.
Perhaps, Brendan, do you have any comment on the more general case? When it comes to climate change, it seems to be something that concern about which is primarily driven ideologically from the left, but the solutions that we've arrived at and the solutions that your organization are advocating for, free market based, are generally more associated with the right. Is there a coalition to be made by that very nature alone?
So potentially, although as you know, right, the idea of market-based policies is not enough in and of itself to get the job done. So on this, I would say I'll just use climate change as an analogy because it's what I can speak to. We don't necessarily have to agree on the what to agree on the how. So I'll be concrete about that. So, you know, there's a tension between Alberta and Ottawa right now over what to do on climate change and how to reduce emissions. But Alberta is very interested in using technology to solve the problem. You know, carbon capture and all these new non-emitting technologies, and that gets Alberta excited. Ottawa, on the other hand, right, is more interested in using market-based policies, but ultimately policies to push the issue along. And the needle we can thread there is talking about how a strategic approach with both policy and a robust industrial strategy can help us actually deploy these new technologies and build these new economic engines that Canada will need to thrive in the 21st century.
Without fully agreeing on the nature of the problem.
We don't necessarily have to agree on the nature of the problem. If we both like a solution, then that can be enough.
Well said. So the next question is a little bit more up your alley. Economist and UBI champion Guy Standing says Sweden's carbon tax is the only serious carbon tax that exists. Could you let people know, if you're familiar with its structure, how that compares to the Canadian model?
Yeah, so excuse me. Sweden's carbon price, last I checked, is somewhere around $180 a ton, which is basically what Canada's carbon price is set to rise to. Sweden was first. They deployed their carbon tax in the early 90s, but they made some mistakes along the way and ultimately corrected those. And there were a lot of policy learnings that Canada can take from that. If anyone is interested in more detail on that, I have written about Sweden's carbon tax in the past. But I think I would dispute that Sweden's approach is serious and Canada's is not, or that Sweden's is the only serious system in the world.
The next question is, I think, not on its face best answered by you. So perhaps, again, I'll turn it over to you, Floyd, but maybe you do have some comment. The question is, how do we actually see UBI implemented? So maybe I'll reframe this question. And if I were to ask you back in 2015, and we were to instead say, how do we actually see carbon pricing implemented? Would you have then, or do you now, with the benefit of hindsight, have an idea of a path for that political change of that magnitude?
Yeah, well, in 2015 is when I first became very interested in UBI, and I always thought that it requires a party to run on it and win, much like the Liberals did, running on carbon tax. And that requires people agreeing on the scale of the problem. And I think the problems of poverty, of wealth inequality, of automation of jobs is going to continue to accelerate. So, there's a couple of ways I see it happening. One is things get so bad that eventually there's just enough consensus that we need a guaranteed basic income, or we need something like a UBI. And already we see support in many of the parties, just no one's actually running on it yet. So that's what UBI Works is doing, continuing to keep it loud, continuing to show the politicians that if they run on it, they could win. So, I mean, I hope if this issue of poverty, and I think cost of living, frankly, is the ticket to promote basic income as a solution. And I think that's only going to get worse. So it might have to get worse before it gets better. So that we have the conditions for a party to run in it and win. So all of your work helping us with the petitions and emailing MPs and showing up in your parties is really crucial. For instance, in the last Liberal convention, there was a policy for a basic income that was in the top 3, I believe, that literally was using language off of research that we funded and promoted. And that you, as UBI Works mailing list people, have promoted through your MPPs through the petitions that you signed. So we have to keep doing that. I also think that the cost of housing, in particular, for a lot of people, is an even bigger issue than climate change in cost of living. And these, we on the Commonwealth side, we are promoting land value tax shift, progressive land value tax shift off of lower levels of income tax as a solution. And we hope that the housing crisis is a way to fit that in the door in the political narrative, since we know that shifting from income tax to carbon tax would reduce the cost of housing dramatically and reduce the incentives that are bidding up its price. Much like the carbon tax has reduced, theoretically, hopefully, and is reducing the amount of pollution that we don't want. We don't want high land values. We don't want a lot of pollution. So these taxes have a similar narrative. We got to bring down the cost of land.
Perhaps the next question also draws a similar parallel regarding how to market this problem. The question is, the tax narrative is, of course, gaining momentum. Poilievre is effectively linking the carbon tax to affordability despite the rebate system and despite the distributional impacts of that. Any advice for countering that? Maybe Brendan, I'll ask if you were to introduce the carbon tax, for the first time to Canadians, is there a way that it could have been done to limit the salience of arguments such as these?
So on this, I would say the benefits of the federal carbon price should have been made clearer sooner. You may recall the first round of rebates that came out in 2019, those H&R Block sandwich boards saying claim your climate action incentive payment. It was basically a line item in your taxes. And from there, it turned into direct bank transfers from whatever firm you bank with. And now the challenge is that those aren't properly labeled as a line item in your account. It's not clear who it's coming from, why you're getting it. So I think something that looked like checks in the mail saying, here is your carbon price rebate, something a little more direct. And I ideally sending it out first, the moment the carbon price actually came into effect, so that people make the connection, rather than just seeing that gas is a few cents more expensive. They're basically billboards for inflation. I think that probably would have helped stop that narrative in its tracks. And I would I could also point to a recent analysis by the Bank of Canada showing that of the 4% of inflation that we're seeing right now, Canada's carbon price is contributing to about 0.15% of that. So it's very marginal on inflation overall.
I want to add a story to that. I remember reading about the governor, Jay Hammond of Alaska, who was issuing dividends that comes from oil revenues. And initially it was just a tax credit. He said no one noticed it. So once they issued it as actual checks in the mail, people noticed it, and nobody would touch the oil checks, the permanent fund dividends in Alaska. Neither party has been able to. In fact, they rather like increase taxes than cut the dividend. And yeah, totally agree with you. Climate action incentive payment, such a silly name. Why not carbon dividend? Or
we have some ideas for rebranding it.
Yeah.
I hope your influence is deep in the government to sell those ideas. Also, I remembered another answer to the previous question is, when will we get UBI implemented? What we're seeing also is, I think if certain demographics, if you're a single mother in this country, for instance, or if you're low income, there are already a number of supports, and more supports have been rolled out. For instance, just this year, I think we're seeing the housing benefits, which is like a basic income, and that's unconditional, but it's a small amount. So what we're seeing is like, it's difficult politically to run on right now, hey, everyone should have a guaranteed income, but it's not as hard to say, hey, people need to afford housing, or they need to afford having children, or we need to stop climate. So we're seeing a number of unconditional cash supports coming through a number of different names: the climate action incentive payments, the GST rebate, the housing benefit. All these things are the working tax income benefit. It's possible that if we continue to have the right governments in place the next 10 years, that we will have something that amounts to half or maybe even 3/4 of a basic income, of a guaranteed basic income, through 5 or 10 different cash programs, just to avoid the political controversy of running on a guaranteed basic income. So once that becomes normalized, that could be consolidated later into a guaranteed basic income. So I just wanted to highlight that this progress is already happening, and we're feeling it in our bank accounts. And it's highly targeted, it's progressive, and I hope we see a lot more.
So the next question for you, Brandon, is, and I think I see many threads of this throughout the chat as well, is what would you say in response to that the carbon tax and carbon pricing in this country in general is ineffective at motivating emissions reductions?
Well, I mean, people respond to prices. That is true now more than ever with the current cost of living crisis. It may not matter at the margin in the day-to-day, but the overall intent, right, is when you're thinking about making those big purchases, say your next car or a new furnace, that you will consider a lower carbon option, and that will ultimately save you money. Businesses certainly think that way, and households, those who put together budgets can think that way too. And there's a lot to be gained and a lot to be saved by letting the price signals do their job and nudge you in the directions that they're intended to.
I suppose if price signals didn't work, then we wouldn't be hearing so much about price signals and the cost of living today. So the next question is, how does a movement like ours expand and grow from policy papers to Zoom meetings to newspapers and rallies? And this question, I think, is maybe in particular interest to the nature that kind of activism, that grassroots activism, played in the passage of the carbon tax, or did not play. Would you care to comment?
So one anecdote I can share here is, one thing I think that Ecofiscal was quite effective at doing was actually improving media literacy on the issue of the carbon price. So we engaged with journalists on a regular basis, and I think really helped improve the sophistication of their thinking on the issue. And that was how we ultimately got our dry reports off the shelves and into the mainstream. And once it got taken up as a political and a social issue, there were a lot of outlets and a lot of journalists prepared to write about it in a more educated and informed way.
Very well said. Something certainly that can be strengthened by our movement. We continually see, if not outright misinformation, then certainly mischaracterizations in the media regarding some of the policies we're advocating for. The next question is, why is it preferable to charge consumers and industry the carbon tax instead of just charging at the source, fossil fuels, when they're extracted?
So we do both. Oil producers pay the industrial price on carbon like any other sector. I think there might be a broader philosophical question here about why are we taxing demand rather than cutting supply. We did analysis in the past, and those who are familiar with the economist Trevor Tombe, he's done great work on this, showing that, for instance, blocking pipelines will reduce emissions at a cost of about $2,000 a ton. And Canada currently is reducing emissions at $65 a ton and ultimately $170 a ton. Supply side policies come with their own set of challenges. I'm not convinced it would actually be politically easier to implement those. But ultimately, it's the end use that is the problem we're ultimately trying to address. So it makes sense to apply the price at that point.
There certainly might be parallels for the housing market right now, where all the solutions that we're hearing about are supply side solutions. And certainly we at Commonwealth are advocating for solutions that touch the demand side of the problem a little bit more as well. The next question is, a pollution tax that is set too high can create dead weight loss just as devastating as that which is created by the externality that the tax is closing. How do you calibrate the right rate?
So the easiest benchmark to use would be the social cost of carbon, which is basically a calculation of the damage that an additional ton of carbon produces when it's emitted into the atmosphere. There are good analyses from the World Bank, the International Energy Agency, and others that suggest that the right price of social cost of carbon, right price, is anywhere between $200 and $500 a ton. There's a ton of uncertainty in there. But more to the point, if we want to get to net zero emissions, which is ultimately the goal, the carbon price will have to rise and increase in stringency over time. We're picking the low-hanging fruit first.
So at the moment, the negative externality as capitalized in the social price of carbon is by far greater than the price itself, and thereby any deadweight loss that it might create.
Yeah, I mean, there is some deadweight loss, but there's also a ton of benefits that aren't captured by standard economic models. There was a series of studies from Alberta actually that showed that the cost of using coal-fired power, the damages caused by using coal-fired power in terms of sick days, asthma attacks, visits to the hospital actually exceeded the economic value of the electricity.
Yeah, and we've seen similar reports regarding basic income that it is by far cheaper than particularly when it comes to things like healthcare and education. That the cost of not ensuring people have access to fulfill their basic needs always end up being borne by the taxpayer down the road in things like the criminal justice system and our healthcare system. So next question is, could examples of shared revenues be reiterated? From what I've gathered so far, the carbon tax is proposed as a funding source for rebates that act like a form of UBI. So Floyd, I think this perhaps references your comment there that there are a couple of payments which taken together might form something akin to a basic income at the moment. And I believe the question is asking for more examples of what could be included in these shared revenues.
Yeah, shared revenue is an interesting frame. Yeah, I mean, those of you who've been following Commonwealth, we talk about economic rents, which is unearned income. It's profit that comes beyond the cost of production, or the profits that are doing harm to society that the carbon tax is trying to address. In a sense, what you're doing is reducing the profits that come from harmful activities, or sharing in the revenues that might be actually due to us all through the value created by nature that nobody created. So looking at this concept of the commons, value created by land, forestry, fishing, oil and gas. These are these are the sources that we looked at in our economic rents report. You can see on commonwealth.ca's website a way to think about how do we share more in the value of our Commonwealth that could fund a UBI. So that is a tack that we are taking. But very much even going all the way back to Andrew Yang's presidential campaign, that the concept was that we need to find a way to share in all the prosperity that's being created through automation, through technology, and that is a good moral justification for a basic income, especially when a lot of this wealth being created is community created. It wasn't created by the individual efforts of any business. So that shared revenues view, if that's what the questioner meant, is something that's is a very good argument for a basic income, which is basically what is our share of all the wealth that's being created? What is our rightful share? We shouldn't have poverty in this time of such great wealth.
One of our frequent contributors, Ed Dobson, and a good friend has asked the next question: should the tax on carbon be progressive? That is, should the rate increase with each additional unit of output?
Oh, I see. For like one particular emitter. I think that's what's being
believe
asked.
so. Ed, do you want to chime in if it's not clear?
Just thinking in terms of the any kind of output of pollution, whether it's carbon or anything, that the charge should be based on an increasing rate on the higher levels of polluted output. It would be similar to, let's say, for example, an industry that uses water. And so the first 100 gallons of water would be at some low price. the next unit of 100 gallons of water would be at a higher price, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be certainly an incentive to reduce use. And with regard to carbon pollution, it would be an incentive to really scale back as quickly as possible. It seems to me.
Right. Okay. So I would say to that, it on paper, it probably makes sense. And as you noted, it's quite often used for large industrial water users. It's called an increasing block rate. It would be extremely difficult administratively to make that work for carbon pricing, to the point where I think it probably doesn't justify the effort. Probably better to just increase the overall headline price and perhaps do an emissions intensity based rebate instead.
And it might work like that somewhat, as you said, as some of the largest emitters don't pay for some of the carbon that they produce and pay full price on the margin.
Yeah, so there'd be two ways to do it. You could make them pay a higher share of their total emissions, or you could incent or reward the best performers by giving them a slightly larger rebate than some of the weaker performers.
Thank you. The next question is a little bit more on the policy and advocacy side. And the question is, how far did you go into lobbying key people in the Liberal part to run on carbon pricing? And did carbon pricing have a history with the Liberals? So maybe I'll depoliticize this question for you and say, when concerning about lobbying and finding champions who are willing to run on this, where is in your experience, were the right people to be talking to? Was it candidates convincing them to run? Was it our civil service, or does it go right to the heart of government?
So I could say off the top that we did not lobby the Liberal Party to run on carbon pricing or to include it in their platform. What we did was produce a roadmap for implementing carbon pricing with the hopes that any party would pick it up and run with it. The Liberal Party just happened to be the party that did that. And it is a challenge in advocacy more generally, right? That if one party champions your cause, you tend, as the originator of that idea, to become associated with that party just by default, even if for good reasons there's no link between the two. Ecofiscal did most of its work engaging the public service. The core of our early reports was aimed at them. It was like the minutia of design details. So we engaged with Environment and Climate Change Canada a lot, mostly at like the Director General level and higher. Also a little bit with Natural Resources Canada, and then the Minister's Office when appropriate.
Floyd, I thought I saw a moment of you about to jump in. Nope. All right, we'll move to the next then. Next question: are there any similarities, challenges, or opportunity that you see between the passage of carbon pricing and other forms of rent capture? Pardon me, as the questions are moving around quite quickly. Things like land value tax, windfall taxes, other forms of resource rents.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the first part of that question.
From your perspective, we've kind of made our pitch about what the similarities might be, but hearing a little bit about the policies that the people in the room here today are concerned about, do you yourself see any similarities, any of the same challenges or opportunities between bringing about carbon pricing and potentially bringing about these other policies that we're advocating for?
So I think the general approach to advocacy and research, there are a lot of lessons to draw, but I think this is probably the time to focus on some of the limitations of the analogy. With universal basic income or any other sort of pollution price, carbon pricing, you need to continually crank the dial, right? It's not just the policies implemented and then you're done. You need to refine it and update it and look for the bugs and fix those. This is going to be like a multi-decade project for Canada. Whereas with something like UBI, I'm not super familiar with the design details, perhaps it makes sense to increase the benefit over time. But it doesn't have to be quite as responsive, I think, to real world conditions. Like there's no analog like reducing emissions that you have to benchmark it against. I would also say the problem in the case of particularly the land value tax, the problem is very evident, right? Canadians can see it, they can feel it. And that's not necessarily the case with climate change, and it's certainly not true across the country as a whole. And the benefits, as I discussed earlier, are diffuse, right? The rebate is not super visible, super salient, and I think struggled from a communications perspective off the hop. So there's some lessons to be learned there, I think, as well.
Well, when you come up with the new naming convention, we could do a campaign to push that to all the MPs for the climate action incentive.
So it is 3 o'clock. So as always, whenever we reach our time limit, we give everyone the opportunity to say goodbye. If Brenda can stick around a little bit longer, we'll try and get through some of the other questions. But Ken will post in the chat very shortly a brief exit survey that if you have any comments on how the meeting went today or things you think that we can improve for the next community call, please do let us know. We read them. We appreciate them. And so if anyone needs to take off, feel free. But otherwise, if we have you for a little bit longer, Brendan, we'd love to keep going with some of these questions.
Yeah, I can stick around for another 10, 15 minutes.
Perfect. All right. So the next question, when will we see major emissions reductions due to carbon pricing? So far, the media is very scant on stories illustrating families or companies making the choices that we would hope the price would incentivize them to make.
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's a very technocratic answer, but the question isn't when will carbon prices reduce emissions? It's where would emissions be in the absence of a carbon price? So it's what economists would call the counterfactual. Canada's target for emissions reductions is 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. So ambitious. There are reasons to think that we probably won't get all the way there. But we should, in the coming years, see reductions of somewhere on the order of 2 to 3% per year as the carbon price rises and as some of the other policies that are on the books really start to bite.
Another question about the role of the grassroots in all this. So could you comment on the role of grassroots organizations such as Citizens Climate Lobby? What role did they play in bringing about Canada's carbon tax with the rebate system? And maybe with your role within at the Ecofiscal Commission, were there links between the two?
Yeah, so credit to Citizens Climate Lobby and Kathy Orlando. They were adamant from the start that a fee and rebate system was the way to go. So prescient on their part. As to their specific influence in a vacuum, I'm not sure I can speak to that, but they were certainly a strong voice at the table for that. Ecofiscal didn't actually take a point of view on what should be done with the revenues. What we did was lay out the menu of options for policymakers to consider. So we had a report called Choose Wisely that showed the economic and emissions impacts of doing just straight up corporate tax cuts, straight up income tax cuts, the rebates, and R&D spending. So it's there weren't a ton of organizations that actually had a point of view on what should be done with the revenues. But Citizens Climate Lobby, I think, was definitely a strong voice for the system that the federal government ultimately ended up implementing.
Can you comment on a little bit further on that decision to present the range of options rather than to select one that the organization would evaluate to be best or something? Was that a strategic decision? Was that just was that taken to remain above that discussion? What was the thought behind that?
Yeah, I think there was really no guidance at that point on what could or should be done with the revenues. So as a first step, you lay out the menu of choices. And different jurisdictions, different governments, different political stripes will pick the option that is best for them. We didn't feel it was necessary to take a point of view at that particular moment in time. As a first step, you want to offer choices. So and that was all the report did.
Thanks. Next is a little bit more into the weeds of carbon pricing again. I hear about two pricing methods with respect to the extraction industry paying. The first is what it pollutes in the actual extraction, and second, what its downstream products end up producing in terms of pollution, and is the latter feasible to add in terms of charging the extractor?
So maybe I could just ask for a clarification then. Are you referring to downstream, like with respect to the oil and gas industry, so refining and below, or are you referring to downstream, like after the point of combustion?
Tim, if you're around, feel free to jump in. But what I imagine is all of the life cycle pollution caused by the product that will eventually be created by what they're extracting. But Tim, if you're here, feel free to chime in. Might have left. So
okay. Yeah. So the pollution that is, I'll try and take the most straightforward
correct. He
here.
says lifetime of the product.
Right. So the life cycle emissions are captured by the price at various points. So the extraction, those entities that are actually pulling the oil or the mineral or whatever out of the ground, they are paying for the fossil fuels that they use at source, or that they're paying a price on carbon at source. But the entire life cycle emissions of a particular fuel are captured at the downstream. So if you're paying at the pump, that particular price is levied on fuel distributors before they actually take it to the gas station. And it does account for the entire.
And
the system as a whole accounts for the entire life cycle.
And that would account for things like plastics, for instance.
No. If the end product is not combusted, then it would not capture that.
Yes. Well, we've got just a few more questions and just a few more minutes. So any chance that a suite of these tax policies could fly? What I assume this question means is that could they be paired together? Could there be a much greater tax reform? For instance, housing, UBI, carbon CC, carbon capture, carbon tax, or is that too innovative for the general public? I'm not sure if you want to be in the role of speaking for the general public, Brendan, but do you have any perspectives?
The one thing I can say about this is that in the efforts to actually implement a nationwide carbon price, there was a grand bargain struck with Alberta, which was basically the Trans Mountain expansion pipeline expansion rather, in exchange for a carbon price in Alberta. And that grand bargain, I don't think was ultimately politically or beneficial from a policy perspective. It ended up tying together two issues that probably shouldn't have been tied together. And as a result, mobilized two very passionate subsets of the Canadian population with very strong and diametrically opposed views. I think it made the issue a little more inflammatory than it should have been. And as you saw, the delays in the pipeline, Alberta got a little more impatient and ultimately ended up pulling out of the Pan-Canadian framework as a result. So I think, while it is helpful to think about policy interactions and the ways that different initiatives and different policies would affect each other once implemented, from a marketing and communications perspective, I would exercise significant caution tying different ideas together.
Indeed, thank you. Next, we have a question just a little bit more practical for people who are perhaps looking to reduce their emissions. I pay the carbon tax for having propane heat in my rural home. I have no idea how to evaluate if going electric or getting a heat pump is cheaper. Are there tools for me to do that?
There are, although I can't think of any off the top of my head, unfortunately. But perhaps we can be put in touch, and I can help direct you towards some resources.
That was me, so I'll reach out, Brendan.
Thanks, Anonymous. And last, there's one more question that references you claiming to be an advocate for UBI. I don't think you have ever claimed that. But it later says, it makes the claim in this question that the carbon tax cannibalizes the financial well-being of Canadians. Could you comment perhaps about on how the carbon tax actually ends up, what the kind of distributional impacts of carbon pricing are for Canadians?
Sure. So yeah, to clarify off the top, I'm not an advocate for UBI. I am, however, an advocate for carbon pricing. So there's good analysis to show that the rebates are progressive. About anywhere from the bottom 6 to the bottom 8 deciles of Canadians are better off with the rebates if they are average consumers of fossil fuels. And it is very important to make sure that these taxes are progressive and don't actually damage the financial well-being of Canadians. And one thing we're advocating for at Clean Prosperity right now is actually a top up to the rural rebate, because rural Canadians have fewer options in the near term to actually reduce their emissions and should be compensated accordingly. It's very important to make sure that this policy is fair. And I also don't think we should lose sight of the broader goal of the policy, which is to reduce emissions. Climate change is also cannibalizing the well-being of Canadians.
Well said, and I can't think of a better line to end it on. So thank you very much, Brendan, for being with us today, sharing your expertise, sharing your experiences, even though you are not yet converted to our causes. We're certainly happy to benefit from yours. Thank you all for your attendance and submitting questions. And I'll remind you again, Ken will put the link back up. We've got an exit survey if you have comments about this call, and if you happen to find yourself in the GTA on October 8th and would like to hear from some of your fellow basic income advocates, please do consider attending, excuse me, on the 18th. Please do consider attending that event. But again, thank you all so very much. Appreciate it. Have a good day, everyone.